I'd like to start with some time travel. So if we could go back to just before you started at UNRISD. You had headed a research center in Africa. You were a senior research fellow in Copenhagen. So what did you bring to UNRISD from those two roles?
I think from the African experience, I brought some ideas about networking because my institute in Dakar had similar structure to UNRISD, which was coordinating research networks. I also brought, I think, to the institute a knowledge of what was going on in the third world research-wise, and I think persuaded colleagues here that there were a lot of researchers out there and that we should intensify our interaction with researchers in the third world. I also, from the Copenhagen experience, I had some idea of what research institutes expect of UNRISD, because I worked in one institute for a whole year, for 18 months actually, and I was made aware of what an international institution like ours is expected to do for the research community. So those are really the two, a sense of what networks look like in the third world and what is expected by researchers of an organization like ours.
Okay. Now it's May of 1998. You've arrived at UNRISD. Can you set the scene?
Well, first of all, strange enough, I came from Copenhagen by train because there was a strike in the SAS. The airport in Copenhagen was closed, so I had come here by train. And then we were also physically, we were not in this building. We were in an annex somewhere out there with some other UN organizations. And my predecessor had left, so there was it's not like handing over in that sense, you know. And there was an office, I was given an office, and there was nothing on the desk, and I'll begin from there. But I knew some of the colleagues in UNRISD before, and I had been involved earlier in an evaluation of the institute, so I had some sense of the institute, but I didn't know very much about the internal mechanics of the institute.
And how has the scene changed? What's different today?
For one, we're in a different physical environment. We are, in the Palais, which is a huge advantage for us. One, we're closer to the library, and for research institution that was vital. And two, I think psychologically we feel much less marginal to the UN than we did there. And like, I think I've grown up in the 10 years here, and I feel that after 10 years, well, one could always have done better, but I think that I gave to the institute as much as I could.
When people ask you what you do, what do you say?
Well, I said I direct a United Nations Research Institute on Social Development. And people then ask what you work on, what themes you work on. Then usually I go on and give a list of the key research ideas, and then the question is, what exactly do you do as a director? And there are at least three things that a director does at UNRISD. One is provide intellectual leadership to the institute. Two, and that takes a lot of time, is fundraising for the institute. And three is representing the institute in various fora, international fora or national fora. And those are sort of basic that every director of UNRISD should do. UNRISD is not heavy administratively in terms of bureaucracy. It's not. I mean, we have a very small, and there's a functioning administration that is related to the larger UN system. So you don't really, as a director, you don't spend that much time in purely administrative work. But those three, fundraising, intellectual leadership, and representing the institute, take a lot of time. Take all the time, most.
As director of UNRISD, you chose to focus on social policy and development.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, that was my understanding of the mandate of the institute. And UNRISD in many ways, I think there's a lot of confusion. UNRISD in many ways worked around issues of social development in one way or the other. In fact, my predecessor, perhaps more than anybody else at the time within the institute, he was very focused on social development issues. But what I felt when I came to UNRISD was that there were many subjects, many themes that didn't always address the issue of social development. That they had an autonomy, a life of their own in a way, And my own view is that this is an institute on social development, and and regardless of what subject you're working on, whether it's gender or ethnic conflict, it has to go back as a social policy, as a social issue, as a policy issue. It has to go back to issues. What social policies are involved in addressing gender, in addressing environmental issues, in addressing ethnic inequality? So that in a sense, it is unfortunate people think of social policy as separate from the other themes of the institute. I think all themes that are related to policy at UNRISD have to be related to social policy. But I felt, it had to be brought back on the agenda. But I also felt that there was although people talked about social policy, we forgot about development. That is, there was a focus on sort of social effects of things now, and I wanted to rethink social policy in what I call in a developmental context. And the reason why I will use the word context as opposed to contexts in the plural was that this was to focus on what does social policy do in the context in which a country wants to develop. So what is in a way the transformative role of social policy in such a context? So it was not just context in different countries, but under very specific, with a very specific preoccupation, namely development. How does social policy act in a context in which development is a deliberate option by a country?
What do you consider to be the single most important work that UNRISD has done during your tenure?
I think that probably the most useful has been the social policy, not most useful, but the most prominent in the institute has been the social policy and the gender program. And I think these are the two that have given the institute the most visibility. And I felt very attached to those, intellectually very attached to those themes. Yes. But of course, there have been other subjects within UNRISD which have their own significance. But I just wanted to highlight those two because they were the most important, both in terms of the resources involved, but I think also in terms of the image of the institute. That people, when I travel around, those are two things immediately people ask me about: this gender program and the social policy program.
What type of outcomes do you see arising out of this work?
Well, intellectually, I hope that if I were to do the social policy program all over again, I would do it differently, of course, because some of the sort of conceptual clarity only came, at least to me, much after the research. That I learned a lot from the research. That if I were to devise the program, I would do it differently. But I think that one aspect of what we've done that might last longer is that we initiated, I think, a process of thinking about social policy that relates social policy to issues of development directly and to issues of democracy. We try to make a link between the debates on democratization and then the debates on development and the debates on welfare policies, which normally occur in different literatures. And we try to indicate that there ought to be some close relationship between these three literatures. That insight, I'm afraid, came towards the end of the program. That at least I became more aware that I was actually struck by the fact that people who write on developmental states and so forth don't often write on welfare policies. And the ones who are writing on welfare policies rarely talk about developmental states, and the ones who are writing about developmental states don't often talk about democracy and so forth. So if I were to start all over again, I would deliberately put that as the central message of the research. It came as an insight. It came much after the after the program had started. I think we will probably have initiated, as some people claim so at least, a new discipline, if you like, a new discipline in the development sense of a much more transformative social policy, as opposed to purely welfare social policy. I hope that the UNRISD will continue to deepen that kind of work, because I think we just scratched the surface. We have yet to get some of the ideas, conceptually tightened up.
How do you see UNRISD in relation to other members of the international community?
Well, we're part of the UN family, and like all families, there are quarrels sometimes. There are misunderstandings, and we usually for those. I think one thing about the UN, which is very complicated, is that there is a very poor tradition of citation of each other in the UN. Ideas, once they come from a UN agency, they become part of the UN. So nobody says, I got this from the UNRISD. And I've been to places where people say to me, why don't UNRISD, help us in shaping policies, and why don't you provide us with documentation for policy making? And then they'll show me, they'll make a speech which is built entirely on UNRISD research. Partly because maybe the speechwriter didn't tell them where they got the information from. I think we've improved our image quite a lot in the last 10 years, but because I think we were much more deliberate about being close to the UN and being more visible to the UN system. But again, we're a small organization and the UN is huge. So to those institutions that are very closely associated, with the work, with our research agenda, we are quite visible. I mean, but you can always do, again, you can always do more in terms of visibility. One of the things that I wanted to do at UNRISD was that there was always a tension in UNRISD between being useful to the UN in terms of inputs into the UN thinking and conducting rigorous research. And sometimes in trying to solve this, there were compromises made, which I thought tended to dilute the quality of research. My own view is that research must be judged on its academic merit. And then you must find ways of translating that research for policymakers. And those are two different processes. Okay. I think as an institute we have the only basis we have for making statements on policy is that we are reporting our research findings. Okay. We are not, say, like WHO reporting a resolution of the General Assembly, which is a political statement. We have no mandate to doing that. And so we have to be really, really, really convinced that when we say something to policymakers, we are providing them the best that we could find out about, from the research. And that, I think, is an extremely important tradition for UNRISD to maintain. That is, there's the temptation to do popular work is enormous. Okay? But in the long run, you lose because why should anybody listen to UNRISD if it's not on the basis of well-grounded research? And I think the UN system they like to feel that when they cite our material, they would like to believe that it's based on some serious work, not simply a statement of the thinking of a director.
Could you share with us an unforgettable moment at UNRISD?
Probably this interview. No, there are just too many. There are just too many. There are just too many. I can't actually. I thought about it this morning. There were just too many things that I'll have to take some distance from the UNRISD to remember which was the most memorable.
But for now, this interview will fit?
Pardon?
This interview will work?
When I think about my work?
No, I was just saying, for now, this interview will work as the
last member? Okay. Yes. No, just that I've had such a great time and learned so much that I still have to list my impression, my experiences in some order. Right now they're quite, they're just a mixed bag of great moments and great experiences, and some hair-raising ones. But I think the most hair-raising one was when there was a discussion in the UN about mandates of research institute, and we were mentioned in a footnote in the Secretary General's report as an example of an institute which was set up without the mandate of the UN, and we got phone calls from people who said, "Have you read that? Have you read that?" And the impression being that we might be closed down or merged with some other institute, and that was really kind of perhaps the most hair-raising experience. But it turns out there were some misunderstandings and all that. But I think it was it was a great experience.
Over 10 years at the helm, what would you consider some of your biggest challenges?
At the Institute?
At the Institute.
I think the most difficult, I think the challenge of any director here is the first thing I had was simply stating bringing my own vision, intellectual vision to the Institute. And basically, changing a research agenda, that's not easy because one way of doing it is change the agenda and change the people we're working with. Okay. That can be disruptive. There's the pros and cons. The other is to change your colleagues, okay, to persuade your colleagues that what you are doing or your research agenda is worth working on. And that I have a view that you can't do that by fiat. You have to convince people that really this is, it's not simply assigning people like, oh, you do this work, you do that work. I think they have to be intellectually convinced that this is, and that's very difficult because people have, their own research tradition, agenda, and they've invested a lot of their, intellectual capital in a particular research area, and then you say move to this one. Some make it, some don't. That's. The second challenge when I came here, there was I thought UNRISD was too many things going on, quite a broad range of things which were interesting in their own right, but they stretched the institute too much, and there was one of the big projects here. In fact, the largest project was on war-torn societies, and I didn't think it sat well within the institute because it was not really a research institute. It was more to do with creating a platform for negotiations and peace building and all that. And there was supposed to be a component of research, which was how research would inform these processes, but just never worked out. And I think. So I felt that there should be a separation, and the challenge was that this was a big project, a multi-million-dollar project, and it was popular among some key donors, and I think popular also within some of the UN agencies, especially with those dealing with political affairs and conflicts. So it was dangerous for a new director to come up and say, "Look, this must move." But I felt I had to do it that way. I felt that, and it turned out it's turned out to be good for both institutions. They have gone their own way, and they're quite big now. They're big and they're focused on they don't have to worry too much about proving their research program, which they had if they stayed at UNRISD. And we also are left with a research agenda, which is what we do. And I think. It was difficult for us to do something else in addition to our research work. And I still believe very strongly, I think research institute's main work is the research. And that's the big thing. So both your inputs and your outputs evolve around that, around your research. If there's no research, there'll be no publications. And if there's no good research, there'll be no money. So I think that this is one should not have some other thing that take attention away from this core research. And of course, the great challenge was also to get money for the institute, which allowed us to do the things we wanted to do. it's very easy to get money on all kinds of things that funders want you to do. But you can simply listen to all the buzzwords and say, "Okay, I'm doing it," and you get money. And I have tried to get the type of money that actually sustains our research agenda. And sometimes, I have had to turn down money that didn't make sense in terms of, it was not part of the priorities of our institute, or the funders wanted something that was less than research, and I just said, no, we don't do that. And I think, so the issue is, it's not simply getting a stable funding for the institute, which I have. I think I stabilized the funding for the institute, but also to insist on the quality of funding, and that to me was very important, because if you, as I said, if you get money for all kinds of things that are, sort of appear politically sexy, and you jump on them, and you will lose focus, and eventually it shows. It shows that you are being driven not by your research concerns, but by the funding out there. And I think for every director, that's really a big challenge. How do you get funding for the institute that does not compromise the integrity of your research process? Another challenge for a director, and I think it's a great challenge, is to convince the UN and the policymakers that good, rigorous research is good for them. Okay. And to convince researchers that the concerns of the international community is worth doing research on. And to do that, you have to convince researchers that you will not interfere with the scientific processes of the research. So we really protect, and I think people know that, that we do not censor people's research work, and it's published in their names, and they get the full academic evaluations and so forth. And then for the UN system, it's very important that when we write policy briefs, they know that if they are good policy briefs, it's because they're based on good research. And unfortunately, on both sides, sometimes there are problems. People sometimes think that, well, UN research is policy-oriented and is controlled, and I don't want to do it's going to compromise my research. And you have to fight, you have to persuade researchers that that's not true. And policymakers are very anxious to get instant results. And so they look for publications that, they can, read two pages that they can read. And sometimes people will say, "Can you write us a 2-page?" I say, "Based on what? We haven't done research on the subject." So that's a series of challenges, endless. And of course, managing a multicultural institute like ours is also, it's a challenge. You have to be sensitive to different cultures, and not only cultures in the traditional sense, but also even intellectual cultures. People from the same culture may come from different universities, and so forth. So all those things one has to manage those. And I think in the process also you learn a lot. You learn a lot about your own culture, and I think your understanding of the world is enhanced by interacting with so many different people coming into the institute.
Well, you might have just answered this, but if you were to list lessons learned while working at UNRISD, what would they be?
Well, that the international agenda on social development is huge, and that unfortunately the UN system does not have the funding or the resources to support the kind of research that international agenda demands. That's the sad thing I've learned about. The UN is terribly underfunded, and it's quite always remarkable when people complain about the UN is not doing this, not doing that, it's not doing that. Every UN institute that I know of is poorly funded when you compare its mandate with the resources, and yet somehow the member states and so forth, they expect certain things to happen. They can cut a budget and expect the next meeting to be as big as last one, even if there's less money. So, and that applies to all kinds of issues. That's one lesson that I learned. The other thing I learned was that as a United Nations organization, although we're very small, we have enormous convening power. We can call almost upon anybody in the world, any researcher really, and they will say they'll say yes. But there is within academia a positive view of the UN. I think people like most academics. Working with the UN agency gives them some sense of being useful, doing something useful in life. So that has been to me a very pleasant surprise to find that academics are very willing, to do things for UNRISD. We don't pay big money like other international organizations like World Bank, but we enjoy such goodwill that we can get people to do to put in their best for very little resources. That has been a pleasant. The unpleasant surprise has been that not many member states really understand the importance of research to the United Nations, and there's a tendency by third world governments to believe that if something is about development, then developed countries should pay for it. We have now gotten two members from developing countries who are funding UNRISD, and I hope we can get more. I think it's very important for member states, even just symbolically, to support research like institutions like ours, if only to establish the fact that they value our work. Which they do. I mean, most of our work, is about developing countries, and some of them are surprised when we tell them that your speech writers or your policy makers, when they write their policy briefs, they use our material. They call us up. They download our documents. So we're useful in that sense, and I think it'd be really an important symbolic gesture if some of these countries chipped in, because as I said, now there are very few countries that support the institute, and how you do that, I don't know. That's next director's big headache. In the years I've been here, I was only able to get on board South Africa from Mexico was already on, and I got South Africa. I hope, and we've been in conversation with some kind of like India, Brazil, and Argentina. So I hope they can, and Chile. I hope they can come on board.
Well, that leads right into the next question, which is, what advice would you give to your successor?
Well, the first is to manage the very complex trick of change and continuity. Because this institute has an interesting tradition, and which one wants to maintain, but at the same time, like any research institute, to survive, it has to change. It can't. So, and in any case, every director that comes to this institute, they come here with their own vision, with their own intellectual capital, their own, and one expects them to, to change. So I would just say, that's the art of managing continuity and change, which is very tricky. But I think every director of any institute knows that that's what they should do. They have to maintain the institute's continuity and at the same time change it. And that's really the advice I would give to the balance between those. It depends. If the one director might be much more focused on really changing, another might say, okay, it depends on how intellectually how the new director feels about what's been going on, or what is out there that's new and urgent that must be taken on board. That's the new director has to do that, and that's I think applies to any director of any ongoing institution, whether it's a company or whatever it is. You have to, it's balancing continuity and stability and change.
What do you think the future holds for UNRISD?
Well, right now, there are a lot of question marks about UNRISD because of this debate about the UN debate about its research organizations, how the research will be organized, and there are two trends one, a much more bureaucratic trend, I think, which thinks just merging things together makes them better, you know. And the other is a much more subtle research point of view, I think, which says that the strength of UN institutions, which are very small, has actually been their small and flexibility. And secondly, UN institutions which are doing research, most of them are highly specialized, so they may seem to be doing this same thing. Like, suppose we said gender, you know, UNESCO may be working about gender, but it's looking at gender from an educational point of view. ILO will look from an employment point of view, and WHO from a health point of view. So it'd be wrong to say that they're doing the same thing, because they're doing different things. And if they're doing different things, the solution is not to merge them. The solution is to find ways for their interacting with each other. That means the more you specialize, the solution for specialized organizations is not merger, but exchange. Okay? And I think there's a confusion there when people say, well, you're doing the same thing, merge them. You only merge them if they're doing exactly the same thing. But they're not doing the same thing. It's quite obvious they're not doing the same thing. Other than that, I think that those countries that fund UNRISD, I think they still are very positive about the Institute. I think the standing of the Institute is quite high in terms of, it's respected. And I think the goodwill towards the Institute by the researchers is there, and that the combination of those three should, enable the Institute to continue. UNRISD is an institute which has historic ups and downs, but I think it has something that makes it survive, which is that it is fundamentally necessary to the UN system, and I think that's why whatever troubles it gets through, people do come to realize that it's an institution that must continue, and that if it didn't exist, we have to invent one, and so it will continue in that sense. With all the storms around it, that it will continue as an institute. And if I have any thing to say, any influence anywhere in the world, I will insist on this institute being defended and being allowed to continue doing its good work.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say that I haven't asked?
Well, yeah. That is a great institute to work for, and I've enjoyed myself thoroughly, and to wish my successor, wish them well, and that they'll be taking on a great job.